Hello and thanks for joining us with Face the State. I'm Dennis Bragg, joined by two of our fellows we like to check in from the National Weather Service office in Missoula. Always like to get them in at least once a year to talk about conditions and everything. Marty Whitmore is the Warning Coordinator Meteorologist. Did I get that right?
That's pretty close.
That's a pretty official title. He's the guy that helps coordinate all of those warnings and the different things that come up throughout the course of the year, especially in western Montana. Works in conjunction with the other Weather Service offices as well around the state. And Ray Nicholas, hydrologist. Always good to see you guys come in. Boy, we have a lot to talk about. This was an active weather year, wasn't it?
It was.
And a lot of stuff. Let's go back a little bit and do a little more post-game on 2015 because in terms of a year, I mean, that was really something to write home about. Let's talk about that hot spell that we saw there at the end of, in May and into the end of June around the 4th of July. Looking back on that, what did we learn from that, Marty? That was a crazy episode for everybody.
It was a late July upper level ridge. That's the kind of conditions we had, and I think we hit 102 degrees, I believe, and I know Boise was 110 degrees. Just temperatures that we don't see, and that's what it was. You know, that's not really necessarily a climate function. That's weather. That's short-term phenomenon, and it was just an unseasonable air mass that came in and lasted a while. The nice thing about that is systems like that we can see pretty confidently a week out, and so we're able to message that pretty strongly, and that was a key because it occurred so early in the season. 102 is always hot, but a month later at our peak temperatures in late July, it wouldn't be maybe as strong an impact as it was there in June. So we were trying to be louder with our message, and that's the kind of stuff we look at all the time. Not just the weather, but how does it fit within the normals for that time of year.
And I know a lot of the concern there was because it was so early. We're going into the 4th of July weekend. People are starting to recreate. They're starting to get out there. So there was a lot of concern about, obviously, wildfire issues. The rivers were a big concern, those kinds of things. So was there anything about that you still look back a year later and it's surprising to either one of you? Is it still one of those, you stand around the water cooler and talk about how that shaped up?
Oh, it is, yeah. I mean, it's surprising in a sense. Anytime you're setting records, across an entire portion of the country, that's unusual. I don't know about surprise. It's hard to surprise me with the weather much anymore because you're going to periodically see these unseasonable air masses, and people try to ask us, well, was that caused by any one climatological feature or something like that? And that's really difficult to say. We just periodically get those short-term patterns that are unusual for that time of year, but we see them. We see a few of those every year. Some unseasonable pattern that that we try to really message loudly.
And I know, Ray, we talked about this last year as we went through that episode. I mean, it was kind of frightening to be on the banks of the rivers, and here we are when you normally would be expecting to see the tail end of the spring runoff, and you're sitting there and it's dry. I mean, it looks like August dry already. And we continued to see those impacts throughout the rest of the year, didn't we?
Yeah, that's what happens in these drought situations. We talk about, drought and what we experienced last year. We had a snowpack that was, very kind of, in some areas it was kind of average, other areas it was below average, but it had a quick melt. It started melting in March. And then by the time we got to May and June, we said, okay, well, we'll get some spring rains now. That'll help things out because we always get spring rains. And we just went dry in May and June. So when you have no precipitation, you have an early snowpack, and then you combine that, you start getting into these extremely hot temperatures in that June time frame like you were talking about. That sets up for a drought scenario. And as we went into the rest of the summer months, we got some precipitation, but because you had such a large deficit of precipitation where you're talking inches, many inches of deficit of precip in May and June, your stream flows are going to be running really low. And they continued to do that all the way through the summer. And then by the time we got to the month of October, the National Drought Monitor, which tracks drought across the country, and we provide input to that National Drought Monitor at the Weather Service, it was at a severe drought mode, almost bordering on extreme in western Montana, and parts of Idaho also, because it did affect Idaho and a lot of the Northwest. And we saw fires along with that and everything, because when you get into drought periods, affects that realm of things also. So that's where we sat from last year going into the winter. And then we were moving into an El Nino winter, which typically can mean in the Northwest that we get a lack of precip and we get warmer temperatures. And as we saw, as we go into the month of what we call the water year, starting in October of 2015 and going through all into this September of 2016, so far into that water year, we have seen warmer than average temperatures, which is typical with El Nino. Moisture-wise, we've been better than we expected. We've been about normal with our precipitation, and that's really helped a lot as far as helping alleviate some of that
Are
drought.
either of you surprised that we didn't have more in the way of especially wildfires or you know, we had drought impacts, but I mean, it wasn't like there was, you know, there was just barely enough water to use, I guess, in some cases. But was that kind of surprising when you got down to the end of 2015? You look back and say, how did we not have and certain places, Idaho, Northwest Montana, did see some pretty significant fires, but it always seemed to me when I look back, it's like, man, this could have been so much worse. Do either of you feel that way at the end of the year?
You know, I don't know. It's certainly area-wide, like you said, there was some big fire activity, and is our best fire season acreage-wise for some time. So I guess, and we felt like we had a pretty active fire season, so that didn't really surprise me. But it really comes down to starts too. No matter what the situation is, you've got to get the starts, and you've got to get them in locations that are maybe tough to initial attack and get out right away. And those are going to be the fires that linger on and become extended attacks. So I think it really played out like that. We expected kind of an active fire season given the conditions that we had coming into it, and that's the way it played out overall.
Yeah. And the rivers, I remember, Ray, we talked in the probably October range, we were talking about it's going to be a dry start here. It's going to gradually rebuild, and it seemed to kind of pretty much do that, didn't it?
Well, yeah, we got pretty lucky as far as this past winter goes, because we did get a pretty good snowpack. I mean, comparing to what we thought we were going to have with El Nino, I mean, when we went to the month of April 1st, we were looking at average snowpack in most of the river basins across Montana. There are some basins that really did suffer and didn't get average snowpack, and those basins are on the wet or the east side of the divide in the Sun, Teton, Marias River basins. Their snowpack has been minimal all winter long, so you know the water deficits up there are probably greater than anywhere. But as far as our snowpack here in western Montana, we did about average. Now that's not so great because we had such a hot April. The average snowpack that we had is now moving its way on downstream in the form of runoff and stream flow and heading out to the Pacific Ocean. And you know, some of it's been captured in some reservoirs and stuff, but it sure is nice to hold on to some of that snowpack so that we can get into the summer months and have the streams be fed by that snowpack, you know, later on, because we had a record warm April this year. We haven't had, you know, temperatures this warm since we've been taking records at the airport out at Missoula here since 1948. So 1948 we started taking records in Missoula at the airport, and from 1948 up until now, this is the hottest April we've had.
You do want to hang on to that snowpack. It's kind of like having extra ice cream in the freezer just in case the relatives come over.
Right.
It's similar to that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about drought too, because I know when we were still running stories in February and March, and talking about the drought monitors still showing, you know, severe pockets of drought, especially in northwest Montana, in around Sanders County, some of those areas. And I had people respond to me and they said, "What are you talking about? We've been getting rain." Explain, Ray, how do we measure drought, and what are the conditions that are kind of watching for?
Well, you know, drought is different throughout the country. There's different effects from drought. You know, if you're out in like the plains of Kansas, you're going to be really reliant on the precipitation, the rainfall that falls. You don't have this snowpack that exists in the mountains to give you your water supply for the year. But here in Montana, it's really what does that snowpack do and how does that build before we really have a good idea on how bad a drought situation we're going to be in. Because we can take a lot of that water, we've got a lot of reservoirs, we can store it in reservoirs, and that can really help us out in our water supplies. Well, this year, when we went into the month of February, we were getting normal moisture from October until then, but that deficit that we had from the previous spring and summer, we weren't ready to erase that yet. We weren't ready to say we're okay because we hadn't seen where that snowpack was going to end up. So the improvements were not being made to that drought monitor based on, wait a minute, if we don't get a normal snowpack, even that normal moisture we've had is not going to be that big a deal when we get into when we really need it.
You got to have that reserve.
Exactly. So that's why we saw more of a change in the drought monitor as we got into the months of March and April, whereas when we were back in February, we were saying, oh, we're still in drought, even though it's raining cats and dogs. That's still not going to do as much good as that snowpack is when you get into the
So factoring in that that late season snow was kind of what helped us climb back out and really pretty much erase, except for a few exceptions, erase where we were at on the drought.
Yeah, really reduce the area of the drought that we have in Montana right now. The areas that we do still have some drought down in the kind of the southeast part of Montana, we have a little bit of drought. Up along the Front Range in that Sun Teton Marias area, we still got some drought because we had such a meager snowpack. And then there's still some areas over in western Montana that drain from the basins, like the St. Regis River up at Lookout Pass. Never really got that great of a snowpack this winter. And then some of the other smaller streams and smaller rivers to the east and in that area are still kind of not that great on water supply.
So that brings up the question too. What have we improved enough that drought could not come back on us? I mean, I know that depends on the forecast and what conditions we get, but how worried are you that we might slip back into where we're starting to see all those ugly colors on the drought monitor, all the reds?
The more sunny days that I see, the more I start worrying about, okay, we could easily get back into a drought situation, especially with the way we melted the snowpack this April. I mean, we melted it so quick. We were so far above normal with our temperatures. And when you look at, warm temperatures, what we call evaporation, evapotranspiration, our yearly evaporation rates are like 30 inches or more. Well, our annual precip is only like 14 inches. So we evaporate a lot more moisture than we get. So it's easy to get back into a drought situation. So what we really need is May to be wet, June to be wet, July to be wet, August to be wet. I mean, we just need to continue to get moisture because when you get into warm temperatures, that evaporation really can affect
that's
you.
a big factor, isn't it?
Yeah, when you get hot weather and no precip, you start moving into drought situations.
Well, let's start talking about kind of where we're looking, and you guys always look at a lot of different models over different periods of time, and we'll come back to El Nino in a second. But spinning off what Ray said, Marty, what are you looking at? He's always wishing for more rain. He's always saying, "Bring it on."
Right.
Everybody else is
Right.
like, "Well, we'd like to have a summer." But what's the latest? I mean, what are we looking at? What's the outlook?
Well, the Climate Prediction Center is really calling for May to be possibly a continuation of April. Warmer than normal temperatures, not a strong signature, but certainly warmer than normal temperatures. And May, June, July, the same thing, continuing a warmer trend for virtually the entire West Coast, but that bleeds into the Northern Rockies as well. Not a strong signal on precipitation amounts, so looking for a fairly normal precipitation, which would be good in May and June. Those are our wet months, so we'd take that. For sure, but it really looks like the warm trend, which is El Nino-ish, it looks like that part of it has synced in, even though El Nino is weakening, but that is synced up, and that's going to be the trend.
So probably getting rain, but in between those, not unlike we've seen during April, where the temperature starts spiking, getting up to the 80s as we get a little longer days, easily in the 90s.
Right.
Could be a warm start to the summer.
Could be, but optimistically, that's some nice days, nice weather. I think not that many people are complaining about April. When we look at it as a whole, or whoa, what's happened here? But we were actually fairly popular during the month of April, which is not always the case.
Not always the case.
Let's
Let's talk about El Nino, because I know that has been something that, and I always get a little frustrated, to be honest, with a lot of my brethren, that report, especially in the major markets, Los Angeles and different places. They start, they act like El Nino is just this certain thing, that it's definitely going to paint the weather in a certain way. And as we've seen over the years, that's not always the case. We kind of every pattern we tend to learn a little bit more. But how did this one? I mean, going in, they were saying it was one of the strongest we've ever seen, and I think it kind of lived up to that billing. But I know there was sort of a delayed effect there for a while, and I know the media in Southern California was going, "Where's the rain? It hasn't come," and then all of a sudden it hit. What are we looking at with El Nino? Starting to fade now finally, or what?
It is. It's fading rapidly, actually, and I think it was the strongest El Nino we've recorded. And some of those other markets have to hit it hard. For instance, Southern California, it can be such a high impact seasonal event for them. Enough rain to cause mudslides and things like that, flooding and whatnot. For us, it usually doesn't have that kind of immediate impact. So we'll talk about it as a long range predictor, but we probably don't shout about it as much as they do in other markets. But you're right, sometimes it doesn't sync up. It's a measured event. It is sea surface temperatures. So they measured it as the warmest sea surface temperatures we've seen. But the atmosphere doesn't always sync up and play the way El Nino sets
And
it.
time of year has a huge impact.
It does.
I mean, this one was kind of setting up late. It didn't really, I mean, it started to gel even, in the fall, but
Right.
it didn't really start to have its impact until later, which is, maybe 2 or 3 months after we've seen before.
That's right. And
So-
we had some pretty good low elevation snowpack around here, better than we've
Yeah,
seen.
November, December was
Absolutely.
pretty good.
Better than we've seen in a while. But then it slowed down, and the warm temperatures that Ray mentioned, that kicked in, and that did look very El Nino-ish. And we can get precipitation, but it'll be in the form of rain in the lower elevations and snow in the mountains, and that plays an impact. So, but it's not a certainty. El Nino and La Nina, they're a pretty strong signal, but they're definitely not a certainty about how the season's going to play out.
Did we learn some things, Ray, from a hydrology standpoint? I know every time we seem to have an El Nino, a La Nina, especially if it's a fairly strong signature, it does teach us some things. Did we pick up science-wise something off this last episode?
Well, looking back at some of the records, I think there's even a little bit stronger signal with La Nina for snowpack anyway. From what we've seen looking at the records, you get into a La Nina year, and you may not always get a lot of snow in the valleys, but La Nina years seem to do pretty good with giving us moisture in the mountains. Now El Nino years, yeah, there's a little more of a signal that we're going to be drier in some of the winter months, but when we go back and look at it, there's been plenty of years like we were just discussing where you've got a little bit more normal with your snowpack. I don't know that you can go back and see a lot of El Nino years where you get an abundance of moisture in the Northwest. I don't know that I've ever seen that as far as in Montana, as far as Montana's concerned. But like Marty's saying, you get into these different episodes and the atmosphere can react a lot differently, and change the way that whole feature works a little bit.
What do you think? I mean, usually we after a El Nino, not a certain thing, but often we see a La Nina year after. Sometimes it just goes neutral, though. Still too early to know how this may shape up and what we might be looking at for next year. Still a ways out from that.
It's early to know for sure. I mean, the going neutral is pretty certain for a while. We run a host of models, and we, meaning the Climate Prediction Center, they run a bunch of models to look at this, and they look at the various solutions. And like any sort of modeling, if there's a big spread in the solutions, you have a little less confidence in the final outcome. They all virtually all of them take it down to a neutral phase, but only a portion of them take it on into a La Nina phase by next winter. And if we're looking for a lot of snowpack in the mountains, that's what we had hoped for, is to go fully La Nina. So they did issue a La Nina watch, which essentially means there's greater than 50% chance of it happening into La Nina. Right now, I don't see many models pointing to a strong La Nina. It'd be maybe on the weaker end of it, but it's pretty early to say for certain on that. But it is really diminishing quickly right now, so it's heading neutral pretty quick.
Which actually, we've talked about this before. That's kind of what we wanted. We didn't want this thing to hang on and go well into the summer months, did we?
Right.
I mean, especially from water standpoint, where you've told me that's would not have been a good scenario.
Well, even now, our latest projections looking at what the stream flows are going to do as we go into the summer months, we're going to be running at below average stream flows now as we go into the summer months, just because we've melted so much snow here in April. So that when I mentioned, drought, and when I look up and I see the sun every day, the more that we see moisture as we go into this summer, the better off we're going to be from a lot of standpoints. And, we need really above normal moisture from here on out as we go through May, June, July. Certainly to help the stream flows as we go into those months of June and July and August. Because right now, the projections are for us to be, maybe close to normal with some of our stream flows here in May. But as we get into June, July, the projections are going to be less than average.
Ray must be fun to invite on picnics.
Yeah, he truly does.
He's the one guy in the crowd goes, we could use some rain here. Yeah.
I know, he truly does want it to rain all the time.
Well, it's true when you look at it. I mean, it's definitely, that's the thing. I mean, every time you get a storm, especially without the thunder, without the lightning, that really makes a difference. The long-term wildfire outlook just came out here a few days ago talking about a moderate fire season. Does that kind of fit with what we're seeing on a forecast basis in some of the models? It's going to be one of those years, be careful, but maybe not a real huge fire year.
That's the hope, yeah. What it really looks like is there's nothing that points toward an unusual year right now, and you weigh everything we've talked about, you weigh into the upcoming fire season, what it was last fall, what kind of snowpack we had. Even more important, how quickly does that snow come off? Even more important than that, the precip in May and June, and maybe most important, the July temperatures and precipitation. And then you need the starts. So everything that we're heading toward points toward a pretty normal season. Also, it's fairly rare to get 2 big years in a row. Has happened, and in fact, fairly recently it happened once, but over history, it doesn't happen that often. So that's the way it's projecting. Although, how quickly the snow is coming off in April worries me a little bit, and all it would take is a dry May and June, and we will probably be revising that wildfire projection. But right now, yeah, it looks like a pretty normal season.
Somebody asked me about that once too. We got an email from somebody. We were talking about the snowpack. I think it was probably about January, and the listener said, "Well, snowpack has nothing to do with the actual wildfire risk. It's all based on the rain that we get in May and June." It's kind of all those things, isn't it?
It is. Just the closer you get to wildfire season, the more weather plays a role. So it has its importance. So snowpack isn't a great predictor of what the fire season is going to be, but it does play a role in how quickly it comes off. We've had years where we've had a pretty good active lower elevation fire season, but the snow didn't come off the higher elevations till really late, and it kept kind of a green cap of vegetation up there, and all the fires would stop once they hit that cap. And so it plays a role, but it may be a no-brainer, but those July temperatures and moisture, that's the key. And then once in a while, we'll get lucky in a really dry year that we won't get much lightning and won't get any starts. And fortunately up here, most of our starts are still nature caused versus man caused, so that's what you need finally, is to get that lightning.
I couldn't believe last August, that was frightening. We had I think it was 3 weeks in a row where just massive fire weather came in on top of us right on a weekend. You had lightning, you had tremendously low humidities, and Idaho was burning like crazy out there, out in Kuski, and all those areas were just on fire. And I kept thinking, oh boy, here we go. Here we go, here we go. And somehow we managed to get through that. And a lot of it was people being careful because we didn't have the man-caused fires, the human-caused fires.
Yeah.
So that's a huge part of it.
It was amazing, the response of people, even around the 4th of July. You remember that with the fireworks bands? And it was great for people to heed that message and have that same respect for the land that everybody else does, and it was great. It was I hate to say surprising, but it was a little surprising, but it was great.
Nice to see.
It was really cool.
May is Wildfire Awareness Month, of course, and we always like to clue people in to do something, look around your property. It sounds like it's going to be a good year to do that. It always is, but this could be a good year to take stock of where you're at and what your landscape is.
Always is. Even a slow fire season, you could have that one fire around your place if you haven't cleaned up some of the vegetation around that, and there's a lot of agencies, land management agencies, that will give you advice on what to do and how to do that, and so there's no reason to not take advantage of that.
I want to mention one thing too. We talked about last year and talk about preparedness. Severe thunderstorm activity. In Missoula in particular, we had a real nasty storm come through, knocked out power for 4 or 5 days, even longer for some folks. That was a perfect example of a quick hit that just packed a punch, didn't it?
That's right, real strong storm that was trekking north there in the Bitterroot, and we had some concerns. It was, I believe, the first day or setup day for the Western Montana Fair.
Right.
So our office was trying to be real proactive, not just with issuing warnings for the storm itself, but also trying to call out to the fair and give them some heads up, since they had some exposure risks because they're setting up all that equipment and tents and things like that. And even then, you just don't get that kind of storm in an urban area very often. Once in a while you go out in the forest and see blowdown from some of those things, but to actually, take down power poles and power lines and things like that, it's just not that common, thankfully, around here that often. And people need to be prepared ahead of time, because once they get that 20, 30, 40 minutes of notice, it's often too late to take a lot of mitigation efforts. Even move your car undercover. Maybe not, because maybe you're at work or maybe you're downtown or something. So yeah, people need to be taking preparedness actions with storms, just like we do with wildfire.
And you guys do a great job. The Weather Service does, all across the state, of getting those all that different information out there with the advisories and the warnings and those things. And I want to ask you too, just as we wrap up here, the phones. I mean, we can get all kinds of apps and stuff on these phones now. They'll follow you geographically. So if you're on some other place in the state, how good are those apps? I mean, what should we be watching for? Is there any particular tricks from the pros?
Well, there's some really good apps, and these usually aren't Weather Service produced, but they use our data, and there's radar loops on there that they can see. It uses our radar loops. It'll include our warnings and watches and advisories. I was watching those really close in Oklahoma, because I got my wife and son are down there right now and flying into when there's tornadoes around, and oh, they're great. They're handy. It's very easy to keep abreast of the weather right now.
Allows us to make sure and see if we have that picnic, and if Ray comes, it's going to rain or whatever the situation is.
Right. Yeah,
well, that I think is the thing that's perhaps most encouraging, is that we now have access to a lot of these things, and so if you get a warning issued, if there's a drought advisory, those kind of things, people can really be apprised, and it can follow you where you are. I was on a trip to the Southwest, ran the same thing in the Four Corners area, and all the same apps that we're working up here. I went down there, and they're giving me the data, so you can plan carefully.
That is
don't go up above 12,000 feet today, because there's going to be some thunderstorms out there. Yeah, exactly. So, all right. Well, gentlemen, I appreciate you coming in. Anything else we need to add for info? Ray, we're watching these conditions. I guess just flood potential. Maybe?
We even though the flood potential is low, this is the time of year when you get those low pressure systems coming in off of the Washington, Oregon coast. And you get a low pressure system sit in, and you could still be, dry for a couple weeks or whatever. And you get when these low pressure systems comes in and it dumps 5 or 7 inches of rain. Yeah, you can have some flooding.
Yeah.
It might be localized, but it could still be significant and cause impacts if it hits in the wrong place.
Flash flooding, always something we want to watch for.
Yeah.
So, guys, I always appreciate you coming in. We enjoy the visit and everything that all of our National Weather Service offices do across the Northern Rockies and across the state, Great Falls, Billings, and elsewhere. It's always tremendous to have that data. Thanks very much. Marty Whitmore, Ray Nicholas joining us this morning, and thanks for being with us on this edition of Face the State.
You've been watching Face the State, a presentation of MTN, the Montana Television Network.